It's 11 o'clock. We'll start in a minute or two, just give a chance for stragglers to join. I see people are still joining at a good rate. Okay, why don't we get started? I'm sure more people will continue to join, but I'd like to welcome everybody to this session where we're presenting, launching our new evaluation on the IMF's emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This report was discussed by the Executive Board last week and is now available on our website, ieo.imf.org. Not just the main paper, but all of the background papers as well. So a real wealth of information. Clearly, the pandemic was not just a devastating health shock, but also an unprecedented shock to the global economy, and that's a massive challenge to the IMF as the effective first responder among the international financial institutions. We at the IEO decided to do an early assessment of how the fund performed in the initial emergency phase of the pandemic on a much faster track than our previous assessments of global crises like the global financial crisis and the euro area crisis. And this decision responded to the very strong interest at the IMF's Executive Board in learning timely lessons on the fund's response to the pandemic. We hope to do this in our new evaluation by looking at not just the processes followed in the fund's response, but also at evidence on the short-term impact of the fund's work. We hope we can thus contribute to thinking at the fund about how to further strengthen the fund's crisis preparedness to deal with future global shocks, which seem likely to become even more frequent in the years ahead. But I want to flag up front that we are not in a position in this early evaluation to adequately assess all aspects of the fund's response or to take full account of some of the longer-term repercussions. And as such, we try to be circumscribed in our recommendations, putting on the table some general directions and ideas to consider, but also being aware that the proposals would need to be considered in a broader context and should avoid advocating for any rigid template, bearing in mind that all crises are likely to be different. Instead, the fund should make sure that it has the right tools in its toolkit that will allow it to respond effectively and flexibly to future global shocks. For our seminar, I'm going to turn first to Prakash Loungani, Assistant Director in the IEO, who led the evaluation team. He will give a broad overview of the key findings of the evaluation, its recommendations, and also how it's been received at the fund. And I will then turn to the three panelists for their remarks on the report and their perspectives more generally. All three were directly involved in helping to shape the fund's response. Rosemary Lim from the board, and Nolan and Alejandro Werner from the staff. We will then open for comments and Q&A with the online audience. And I would just note that the session is being recorded and will be posted on our website later today. So let me now turn over to you, Prakash, for the presentation.
Thanks very much, Charles. Let me share my screen. Can people see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you all for coming to this discussion of our latest report, the IMF's emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Charles already told you that this is an early evaluation done to draw lessons to help the IMF face future crises even better. It covers 4 topics, the ones listed here: strategy, effectiveness of emergency financing, reformulation of outlook and policy advice, and HR and budget response. I'll focus mostly on effectiveness of emergency financing in the interest of time, but happy to take questions on the other issues as well, and perhaps some will come up in the remarks that the panelists make. So just a reminder that typically IMF financial support comes with strings attached. It's dispersed in tranches after certain conditions are met. That was not the strategy adopted during the pandemic. IMF support this time mainly came through its emergency financial assistance programs. It was given with limited conditionality, and access limits were doubled very early on at the start of the pandemic. So this approach allowed the IMF to disperse quickly to many countries. So this chart, if you just look at the arrow on the left, is pointing you to the number of programs that were approved very quickly. So in April, the IMF approved loans to this emergency financing assistance to 40 countries, and then to some 20 more in May. So 60-some countries got assistance very quickly, almost at the start of the crisis. In terms of the dollar amounts, this was about 30 billion in lending to the 60+ countries. So, in terms of scale, this was about the scale of one of our bigger programs that would go to one country, either under a standby arrangement or under a precautionary arrangement. So as I said, I'll focus on trying to give you a sense of how we assess the IMF's response. So, one could think that on the one hand, that the IMF provided too much financing on too easy terms. So in the provocative way that Ken Rogoff often writes about these things, he wrote an op-ed saying the IMF became an aid agency. On the other hand, you may also argue that given the scale of the crisis, the IMF actually did not do enough. So I would warn you at the outset that we're not going to end up giving you a yes, no answer to this question of whether the IMF became an aid agency. We'll give you some evidence that allows you to reach some judgment for yourself, and I'll tell you what judgment we reached in the team. So I'm going to stick on this slide for a minute rather than advance to the next ones. I'm doing this deliberately just to give you the sense of the arguments before I take you through the charts. So on one side of the ledger, let's think about the argument of whether the IMF provided too much financing on too easy terms. What you'll see is that the IMF did indeed give assistance to countries that were in very difficult debt situations. And we do feel that the risks that this was starting to pose to the fund's balance sheet were not sufficiently highlighted in the very early months when most of the money was going out the door. We also, as Charles mentioned at the outset, are not in a position to fully assess what the longer term implications of this debt buildup might be. So in that sense, we do think that the fund, even though its role is to take on risks, may have done so in a way that could have been better flagged at the outset. Now, did the provision of emergency financing crowd out the IMF standard lending, and the second bullet on the left-hand side there? The fact is that during the pandemic, there was very little appetite for standard IMF lending. Our interviews with country officials confirm that. They say that had the IMF come knocking on their doors, figuratively speaking, since no one was traveling, if the IMF had come knocking on their door with a matrix of conditions and a standard program, they would have said no thank you and ended the Zoom call. So one can argue back and forth, but in practice, we don't think that this was a practical fear. There was no appetite for other programs. What is worth thinking about is whether staff's expectations that countries would move on to standard programs in 3 or 4 months, whether that was sufficiently realized. The third bullet on the left was the money given without adequate concern about misuse of the funds. Here we do think that these so-called governance safeguards, the safeguards against corruption, could have been stronger at the very outset. They were strengthened, but again, by that time, a lot of the money was out of the door. Moving on to the other side of the ledger, there's also a sense that the IMF didn't do enough. This was a grave crisis, and many country officials, while grateful for quick disbursements, also told us that the assistance wasn't quite commensurate with what they perceived there needs to be at the moment. You'll see that the IMF ended up filling 25 to 35% on average of the financing gap for countries. So it wasn't insignificant, but one can argue whether the IMF could have done even more in such a severe crisis. And there were also cases, about a dozen or so we flagged, that where the IMF did not provide emergency assistance for policy or debt concerns. These were admittedly very difficult cases, but nevertheless, they raised some reputational risk for the fund, in our view, by creating a perception of lack of even-handedness. Now, I said that the IMF did 25 to 35% of the financing gap. Now, of course, the IMF shouldn't be expected to cover the full gap. In particular, IMF funds are expected to have a catalytic effect by bringing in other official as well as private sources. So what is our evidence on that? On that, we find that while in the report we do flag what we call a kind of lack of strategic coordination at the very senior levels between the bank and the fund, and we flag cases where the bank and the fund went in different directions. I think our bottom line is that overall, the bank and the fund played well together. There was very good cooperation at the country level, which is corroborated not just by our case studies, but by the case studies done by our sister evaluation office at the World Bank. In 75% of the cases, countries got support from both institutions or didn't get support from either. And what we show is that World Bank support was higher in cases where the fund also provided support than in cases where the fund did not provide support. We also show, using some very good econometric techniques and sort of granular data, that fund financing seems to have helped unlock private capital flows as well. So with that, having told you that what we're trying to do is to give you the balance of the argument, let me run through the slides. So this slide basically tells you that the IMF was lending to countries that were in very difficult debt situations. This slide gives you a sense of the tightening of governance standards over time. It shows that governance safeguards were light, which is cleverly shown by the lighter shade at the start of the period, and they were tightened as the period went on. So you can see by April 15th, 2020, you see a lot of light, and then some darkening, and then by after May 1, 2020, you can see that there's a lot of dark shades showing the application of governance safeguards. But as I told you, 40 some countries had received financing during the month of April before these safeguards were tightened. Now, sort of turning to the other side of the ledger, did the fund not do enough? This chart shows you that the fund provided 25 to 30% of the financing gap. And so countries had to draw down their reserves quite a bit. That is shown by the blue part of the bar. And this was particularly the case in the small developing states. So these were tourism dependent economies that were hit extremely hard. And these are some of the cases where authorities told us that the fund support could have been bigger given the scale of the crisis that they were facing. This slide tells you that the fund's support was basically governed by the various limits on access. So that's why in the very left panel, most of the countries are lined up along the 45-degree line. And there was little correlation of access with other things that you might think should govern how much the fund provided, such as the staff's own forecast of how bad things were going to be or perceptions of corruption. Those are the other two panels that show little correlation. And even though there was no correlation with overall external perceptions of corruption, the fund nevertheless, based on its own internal assessments, did not provide access to about a dozen countries, some for governance concerns and some for debt. This slide shows you that, as I mentioned, in 3/4 of the cases, countries either got support from both institutions or from none, leaving a substantial 25% of cases, including some important ones listed on the left of the slide, where the bank and the fund sort of went a bit in different directions. This shows the catalytic effect, pointing out that not just the World Bank, but almost every other major multilateral institution provided greater funding on average to countries which received fund support compared with countries that did not receive fund support. And this is the evidence on the fact that our most sort of granular analysis shows that there was a catalytic effect on private flows as well. So let me stop here and give you the bottom line. I think in the report, if you've taken a peek at it, we characterize the fund's response as agile and effective. We call the strategy that it adopted pragmatic. We found that the authorities were really appreciative, particularly of the quick disbursements. And so, yes, we do find that risks and governance safeguards could have been flagged a little bit earlier. And yes, all the chickens have not come home to roost from the chosen strategy in terms of the debt buildup and inflation and so on. But overall, our bottom line is that the fund did the right thing for the circumstances it was facing and given the information the fund had at the time. We also reach broadly positive views about the fund's formulation of outlook and its policy advice. So we think that the fund reformulated its outlook and quite well in the face of a very uncertain situation. We do point out that there were two areas where forecasts were off the mark. One is that the June 2020 growth forecast for that year turned out to be excessively pessimistic, particularly for the larger countries. And we also note that the inflation forecast for 2020 missed the upsurge that took place. On fiscal policy, we are generally positive. We think that it was the appropriate advice for the circumstances. We are a little less favorable to monetary policy advice, which we can go into if there is interest. On HR and budget, we recognize many positive initiatives and steps that were taken. Nevertheless, we do also feel that there was some delay in getting people to where they were most needed. A chart that is a point that is made in this slide, which shows that the African department and the Strategy, Policy and Review department, which faced the greatest needs at the onset of the crisis, did not actually get resources, staff resources on net during the crisis. They got people in, but the voluntary free market system of internal labor reallocation within the fund meant that they also lost just as many people. So on net, they weren't really getting resources. And on the budget, this time the budget was saved by the lack of travel and lack of events. So there was enough money for others, other uses, but that may not be the case next time around. So that's kind of the high level summary of our findings. Perhaps I should stop here, just noting that we do make 2 recommendations, which Charles broadly described, and to say that both recommendations did receive broad support, both from the managing director and staff in the managing director's statement, and from the executive directors in the board meeting that we had last week. And the next step would be for management and staff to formulate an implementation plan within the next 6 months to put in place some steps that would implement the board endorsed recommendations of this evaluation. And we hope that our findings and recommendations will also be useful for the many reviews, internal reviews that are ongoing at the fund. So with that, thank you all. I want to extend a thank to my large team. It takes a village to produce an evaluation. These are the pictures of people who work directly for the evaluations, and thanks to everyone else who helped us through interviews and in many other capacities. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thanks very much, Prakash, for a very succinct and nice overview. I think you hit all the main points in the evaluation. So let's now turn to our 3 panelists. And I'll start with Rosemary Lim, who's Executive Director for a constituency representing 12 Asian countries at the IMF board. So Rosemary, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'd like to congratulate Charles, Prakash, and the IEO team on the evaluation report, which we have found to be well written and comprehensive. At the board discussion last Monday, and as Prakash mentioned, directors broadly welcomed this early evaluation of the fund's emergency response to the initial stage of the pandemic. Aside from the key recommendations on how to better prepare for the next crisis, the richness of the evaluation itself contains no less important information and provides us with the big picture on the extensive policy that has been taken and valuable lessons to be gleaned for possible future global crises. I'll start off by evoking memories of the pandemic because it provides the necessary context. When COVID-19 hit, lives and livelihoods were threatened, and the world faced a very heavy burden. While the worst of the pandemic is now behind us, the experience then was one fraught with uncertainty as we navigated uncharted territory, and one which has left such an impression that our way of life and mindset will not fully return to how it was before. This brings me to my first point. IEO's key finding that the fund's response was agile and effective during a crisis like no other is testament to the fortitude of the institution, staff, and management. They say a crisis brings out the best in us, and the fund delivered exactly to our best in responding swiftly, boldly, and decisively to support members, provide pragmatic solutions, and in so doing give confidence to members and markets alike. One example of the swift response is the expeditious deployment of emergency financing, where in the first 3 months of the onset of the pandemic, a record 62 members received much needed financing support. This could not have happened without our dedicated staff, particularly for those in frontline departments. So kudos to the countless staff who stood up to be counted during the pandemic period and beyond. Naturally, in exceptionally challenging circumstances when things move at a very fast clip, there may not be time to take pause and consider all angles. Here, the IEO evaluation provides an important rear-view look into early learnings as we continue to operate in a world with crisis upon crisis. I'll highlight some observations framed against the three-pillar fund mandate of surveillance, lending, and capacity development. First, on surveillance, tremendous economic pressures and constraints on policy space or capacity meant that members, especially developing economies, small states, and low-income countries, do not have many degrees of freedom to respond to the pandemic. The role of the IMF as trusted advisor is all the more important here. The evaluation highlights the importance of maintaining close engagement with country authorities and giving weight to bottom-up analysis regarding the outlook. I believe this is very relevant, particularly to emerging market and small states, since the magnitude of the impact and the pace of recovery vary greatly due to different starting conditions and approaches in mitigating the impact of the pandemic. Second, on lending. The evaluation rightly pointed out that while the fund's pragmatism with emergency financing has provided much needed support, as the pandemic abates, there is strong rationale to transition members to a UCT quality program that will induce structural reforms and increase the macroeconomic resilience of countries. Tapping on the trust built from relationships forged with authorities during the pandemic could facilitate members coming to the fund early to consider a UCT program should the need arise. And when they do, I also appreciate the IEO's observation of even-handedness as an important aspect. I see this principle as very important to uphold the credibility of the fund. Although each program arrangement has necessarily to be tailored to country needs and circumstances, equality of treatment for all members needs to be maintained in terms of open access, quality of information and recommendations, and speed of response. Third, on CD. During a pandemic, implementing CD presented its own challenges, especially for vulnerable and small developing states in the absence of direct interaction. Virtual delivery worked, but also faced constraints in terms of infrastructure and effectiveness. With high uncertainty and increasingly diverse risks, for example in new areas such as climate, digitalization, and cybersecurity, CD implementation needs to be more coordinated with other institutions to reduce overlap and create efficiencies. I would also like to touch on the use of IMF internal resources, particularly human resources. An institution is only as good as its people. I have mentioned the dedication of staff earlier, but the appreciation cannot be expressed enough for staff and HR's superb efforts to rise to the challenge and position the fund better to help members navigate the crisis. It was heartening that many staff volunteered for redeployment to help bolster manpower needs. As we continue to operate in a shock-prone environment, it is pertinent to bear in mind that staff allocation should match the dynamic needs of the organization and manage the risk of piling on too high a workload for an extended period of time. Staff are the main assets of the fund, so their well-being needs to be prioritized. This leads me to what we can do together to improve crisis preparedness from the perspective of the fund's support to members and our own corporate agility. Here, the recommendations provide food for thought. As an institution, the fund stands ready to help members, especially in times of crisis. In this vein, the framework and toolkit should have high agility in dealing with crisis. Improvements can be made all in the nature of calibration rather than a total overhaul. Input from members, including from developing countries which often have specific challenges, needs to be continuously captured by the fund and through evaluations, so the principle of even-handedness can be upheld. And considering the possibility that the nature of crisis in the future can be more varied, it will be useful to strengthen the process of reviewing and approving emergency financing, but care should be paid to avoid developing framework and procedures that are overly prescriptive and specific, which then pose limited helpfulness in crises of different natures. I also appreciate the need to continuously reinforce institutional preparedness. Prakash highlighted areas for consideration in his presentation. Beyond specific initiatives, horizontals such as the adequacy of resources, process, and technology needs to be ensured, so the fund can be more flexible and concerted in our efforts to deal with future crises. It is also important to coordinate the crisis framework with the World Bank and other IFIs considering that the nature of future crises could be beyond the core competencies of the fund. So I'll leave it here. Thank you again.
Very much, Rosemary. I think you gave a nice flavor of your reactions to the report, and I think I can say that many other executive directors who shared your perspectives, and it's certainly the case. I think all executive directors really noted the dedicated work by staff at a moment of great need for the membership, and expressed a lot of appreciation. So now I'm going to turn to two of those very dedicated staff members who worked incredibly hard in the heat of the crisis. Alejandro Werner was the director of the Western Hemisphere Department during the pandemic. He left the fund, I guess, about a year and a half ago, and is now the founding director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. But be really interested to hear your perspectives, Alejandro, both on the report and more generally what it was like to be working on the front lines of the crisis response.
Thanks, Charles, both for the invitation to comment and for those very nice comments on my work. And what we did during the pandemic definitely was the highest point at the fund. I mean, really helping the majority of our members overcome such a humongous crisis. I think that's where we see the fund at its best. And I think this report really shows how well the institution adapts and moves to supporting members in extremely dire circumstances and completely unforeseen circumstances. So I should say from the beginning that my comments should not be seen as a critique of how we engage, and to some extent it will be an self-critique as well, because I was part of that team. So many of the things that I would say today basically mean that maybe I was not convincing enough, or I didn't say things strong enough during our team discussions. But I think overall the response was effective, was quick, and as I said, it showed the fund at its best. I want to congratulate the team led by Charles and Prakash for doing a very stimulating paper, and really made me think hardly about many of the points that I will highlight now. I think my first point is that I do think that the international community response was too small. It was incredibly small. I mean, if you take the numbers from this report, if you look at changes in commitments from 19 to 20, if you add the World Bank, the IMF, ADB, IDB, and other MDBs, you have less than $100 billion. If you take the total commitments, you have maybe $250. If you look at the disbursements, if you look at the change in disbursements, you have 75 billion as well. If you look at the total disbursements, maybe you have $200 billion, less than 1% of GDP of EMs and developing economies. This was a pretty timid response. The IMF was part of this response, so we cannot say that it was, in terms of size, a good response. Part was the fault of the IMF, part was the fault of the international community, both advanced economies and developing economies. I think some of the countries with whom you spoke, they were offered significantly beneficial structures within the confines of EFFs or standbys, and they were not willing to move ahead. So it is not, the fund is the international community as a whole that I think was not up to the challenge in terms of the shock that we received. Did we have space? Obviously we had space. I mean, we had a 1 trillion balance sheet. The World Bank, the IDB, the ADB, etc., many of those multilateral development banks under the mantra of the AAA were extremely conservative. Even within the AAA, they could have leveraged their balance sheet much more. And even if they lost their AAA rating during the pandemic, they would have funded themselves at interest rates that were much lower than a AAA was funding itself in 2018 or 2019. So from the point of view of the cost of the funds versus the benefit of deploying those funds, it made all the sense of the world. And I think these arguments of the slippery slope, etc., well, it is a slippery slope when you're confronting a world pandemic. So I think there we were, as I said, extremely conservative. We should have done enough. I think within this restriction of what the international community was willing to do, the IMF did really good. I think my second point is I think this assessment of risks and the management of risk is extremely biased, both in the way we design the response, but also in this report on assessing risks and not assessing rewards. I think the benefits of lending more were humongous in terms of lives, in terms of what we have called the scarring from the pandemic, that in net present value is going to be huge. So I think the benefits were very, very large. And also I think when we assess financial risk to the balance sheet of the fund, we focus too much on the DSA. And I think the financial risk to the balance sheet of the fund should consider that we are a senior creditor. And within taking into account the senior creditor status, I think the risks to our balance sheet were much, much smaller than what or how they are assessed in the report. Also, I think when you look at the whole portfolio of lending that we undertook, I think we're going to do great. I mean, you look at all the contingent lending that we did and the premium that we're going to get from that. So 10 years down the road, when you assess the financial impact of this operation, it is going to show that we were extremely risk averse. My third point, I think on the forecast, I totally agree. I think it was necessary to move to a top-down approach, to a more top-down approach, because we had a global shock and we had to be very consistent on how we address that at the global level. And we need to assess idiosyncrasies in each country, but on the balance, it needed a heavy weight on the global aspects than on the local aspects, and I think we were right on that. I mean, you mentioned that we missed on inflation. I think that on the policy response, I think the fund was right on the mark on supporting a strong fiscal and monetary policy response. I think then this mixes on my second point on this issue on communication. I think focusing too much on spend but keep the receipts. I think to me it was never that clear what keep the receipts meant. I think as a more technocratic institution, we should have had a more technocratic line in saying spend, but maybe approve contingent adjustment policies once the pandemic is over. Really think about how you're going to consolidate 3 years down the road. The political space was there. If you go to Congress to ask for 5% of GDP of additional spending in the next 2 years, you can also ask Congress, well, when the economy is back to trend or back to 2019 levels, you allow me to go ahead and do these fiscal adjustments. I think we miss that in terms of our communication and in terms of our policy advice from the beginning. I think we should have thought and supported countries a little bit more on how you communicate the very hard trade-offs you have during the pandemic. I think communication policies on how to communicate to society, trade-offs between the economy and health are very hard. And I think we stuck with very easy lines. There are no trade-offs between the economy and health, et cetera, et cetera. I think maybe that was right when we thought we were going to squash R and bring it down below 1, and this was going to be over. When this was a 2-year thing, I think the trade-offs were a little bit more difficult, and I think we got stuck on a very simplistic communication line. On instruments, I agree with what the report says. This was a completely out of the box shock. We should have thought about additional and different instruments. However, we stuck and we amplified the box as much as possible. But for example, I do think we could have, given the uncertainty, increased the size of the emergency financing. And even in those cases of uncertainty on the DSA side, we could have just asked countries to have a standstill on debt service to private sector creditors. So to me, I mean, it was very important to guarantee that the money that we were giving these countries was going to go to support the population and not to pay creditors. But if that was guaranteed by a standstill, I think we should have gone and lent a little bit more. We should have been a little bit more forthcoming on how maybe some of our toolkit and our analytical tools were kind of useless given the size of the uncertainty we were facing. On the budget, I think the board should have moved much faster and much more aggressively. I mean, you look at Amazon, they doubled their employees. The example is very bad, but from 800,000 to 1.6 million people, and we were discussing 60 FTEs. I think we should have been much more aggressive, much quicker. I think the recommendation of being much more top-down, I think the fund having this kind of market approach during the pandemic, management should have been much more nimble in saying these 20 people move here, these 20 people move there, we hire these 30 people and we use them to help our countries. I think the board should have been more supportive of this. It should have been more supportive of simplifying processes much more aggressively. And I think of supporting staff, not only saying that the staff is the best thing that we have, but not doing the things of, because of missing a forecast within a huge forecasting round that was relatively good, closing an office and moving, I think, to the border or to the limit of bullying the staff during that process. The discussion of surcharges, to me, was a red herring. It's a discussion that we should not have had during the pandemic. It affected only a small number of countries, and some of those countries could have negotiated an EFF, have additional resources to support their population, and I think that was the relevant discussion that they should have been having. Tailoring access, given that the access was increased, but to a small amount, everybody went to the limit. I think it's very hard to make that argument. And finally, on anti-corruption, I think it's a tricky issue, how to strike the right balance, and I like the approach on the paper, the right balance between trying to guarantee the good use of the resources, but not asking for extremely hard to implement solutions. So with that, I really think this was a very good report, given the time constraints and given the difficulty of such a huge operation that the fund undertook during the global pandemic. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. I think you gave some very strong suggestions on how the fund could actually have gone even further than it did. We were certainly reflecting, as we prepared a report on what would indeed be the most appropriate, and it's very tricky. There's balancing all the different considerations, but I think you certainly expressed your view very eloquently. I'm not going to turn to Sean Nolan. Before I do, let me invite our broader set of participants, if you'd like to comment or ask a question to Prakash or the panelists, then please use the chat function in Globex, because once we've given Sean a chance to speak, I'll then turn to the chat box. So Sean, be interested to hear your thoughts, and if you have any immediate reactions to Alejandro's comments, that'd be particularly interesting. Sean was Deputy Director in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department in the fund during the most difficult emergency months of the pandemic, and therefore you were not the one responsible for putting the strategy together, but certainly in terms of the implementation of the strategy, you were very much on the front line. So Sean, over to you.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'm delighted to be here today, an opportunity to comment on what is a very, very good report. And to echo what others have said, like any IEO report, it's backed up by a truly impressive body of background papers and analysis that allows the reader to explore areas he or she is interested in, or she is not convinced by. And I think it's important to stress the amount of research that it underpins the main report. I agree with most of the conclusions of the report. I actually also agree with a lot of what Alejandro said. So I thought I'd organize my comments by picking up on a few areas where I actually think where I disagree or think that the conclusion, it could be sharper or different. And I'll also seek to be slightly provocative as well, just to add to the conversation. Firstly, and I'm going through the the structure laid out in the report of strategy and then financing and then down to corporate response. Firstly, I agree that the fund did remarkably well in getting the idea of the scale of the pandemic and doing so very quickly. Remarkably quickly, actually, and being willing to listen to epidemiologists and others and drive models off those assumptions. The fund 10 years ago would not have done this. And so this was, I think, a comment on how much the institution has evolved and become more outward looking. I think also was a comment on two issues that Warren mentioned. One is the fact that there was increasing use of scenario analysis, discussion of issues like pandemics prior to the event. And also there's a dedicated risk unit established in SPR and a whole risk apparatus to look at risk. So all of which I think facilitated a quick response to an emerging dramatic risk. So, and I think this feeds into the report's recommendations about preparing for the future. So it wasn't just the staff or management reacted well. A lot of the practices that had been built up in previous years allowed this to happen. Now let me dissent somewhat from a couple of the comments on strategy, and I'm going to pick up on two. One is you conclude the balance of risks could have been analysed in greater depth and received more emphasis at the outset. I think I disagree with this actually, for a very simple reason. We were not in a normal situation where probabilities are known and risks and sensibly discussed. We were in a situation of what Kay and Knight called radical uncertainty. You could have discussed the risks as much as you like. You had no idea what the probabilities were. It was incredibly uncertain in February and March. So actually thinking a lot of devoting much more time to discussion of risk would have been a waste of resources. A second one is, and I'm going to use the exact language of the document, is to say more could have been done to forge a strategic understanding with the World Bank. And what's missing from this sentence is more could have been done by who? Because you could have had meetings between senior management of the bank and the fund every day for 3 months. And unless one side got exhausted, you would not have achieved a strategic alignment. So here, the answer to who, by who, is the shareholders. When the two institution management, senior managers have different views, the shareholders need to step up to produce alignment. And I think that issue of by who is quite an important one. Turning from the strategy to the policy advice, I actually echo very much what Alejandro said about viewing the top line messaging as being actually perhaps very slick but not helpful. Doing what it takes but keep the receipts is, when you analyze it, is pretty vacuous. And remember that the fame of the do what it takes remark came from Draghi's comments back in 2012. And Draghi wasn't offering advice. He was making a fundamental commitment by the institution at the center of the crisis that he would do, or they would do what was needed to resolve. So the fame of the expression is legitimate, but offering it here as advice didn't mean anything. So what really was the fiscal policy advice? I suppose it was kind of spend a lot more, fiscal stimulus for various reasons. And the financing side was kind of ignored. And it was ignored because in the developed countries, you really had a dramatic decline in investment. So you had an abundance of savings and you had interest rates that were very, very, very low. And therefore borrowing was very, very easy. But that ignored the range of countries that did face financing constraints and where the analysis could have been the discussion needed to be fleshed out quite a bit more. So I think that actually, it was smart, it was clever, but it actually was not helpful. And a stronger, more macroeconomic kind of line would have been more productive. So much for policy advice and strategy. What about issues on the lending side? Well, I wonder, could I stick up a slide here for a moment? Excuse me, I beg your pardon. Let me see if this works. Can I share this? I want to go down and see the comments that specifically that are made here in the report, and this is taken from the report. One is the issue, the comments and the concerns expressed around the quality of the fund's balance sheet deteriorated significantly, especially for PRGT credits. I think this point is really seriously overstated, and this actually echoes what Alejandro said, but coming at it from a different level. If you want, firstly, the lender of last resort's balance sheet quality should deteriorate in a crisis. If it doesn't, it's failing in its activities. Secondly, look at the GRA balance sheet in October 2022. 2/3 of the entire credit is accounted for by 5 countries: Argentina, Egypt, Ecuador, Ukraine, and Pakistan. The scale of exposure to these countries had almost nothing to do with the pandemic. It had to do with conventional lending operation. It's a reminder the main risk to the balance sheet comes not from how you lend, whether it's UCT versus emergency financing. It comes from who you lend to and how much you lend them. On the PRGT side, again, maybe risk debt issues are slightly a more greater concern there, but this goes back to Alejandro's point about preferred creditor status. The fund always gets repaid. So the issue of concern in lending to low-income countries is not that they won't pay us, it's that they will be in a position where they start running arrears and they will be in deep problems as a result. So I think being concerned with the risks to the balance sheet, it's something it's naturally one does, but I think it's much overstated. I felt the report actually concluded correctly that facility shopping was just not an issue. It's a frequent concern that's raised. It wasn't germane in the context. I noted Prakash's point that authorities emphasized this point, that they wouldn't have been interested in UCT type programs in the midst of the crisis. But I think it's also fair to say UCT programs wouldn't have made any sense in a massive area of massive global uncertainty, saying, here's the quantitative PC, it's essential you meet it in January, and then saying, oh, March, oh, forget that, everything else has changed. It made mockery of the UCT. UCT would have been a kind of a fake in those circumstances. I noted the judgment call, which I think hopefully is visible on the slide, that higher across the board access to emergency financing would not have been appropriate. And I actually disagree with this. I'm not saying the statement is, I'm not saying I'm sure what the answer is, but I think concluding this is not correct and needs to be looked at in the work going forward. The 100% was reached by multiplying 50 by 2. And I think one can do a lot more analysis and assessment of the past to say maybe the emergency financing limits should be higher. So I also would defend the decision to stop at 100 in 2020 because the board would not have bought it, so the shareholders wouldn't have gone along. So backward looking, it was a sensible decision, but looking ahead, I think that emergency financing limits need to be looked at closely. A more tailored approach to access could have been helpful. I'm not really sure what this means actually, because if the limits on emergency financing are not large relative to the scale of the balance of payments need, you're going to get the bimodal outcomes that are referred to in the report, the 100% outcomes. And so I think when you're talking about tailoring, at times you have in mind more tailored emergency facilities in which you have higher limits, say for small developing states, countries whose borrowing capacity, whose economy has been blown away by the shutting down of the single industry. And on governance safeguards, I think we have to be really candid here, and I think the report ends up with the right conclusion, but perhaps we should be a bit candid about why the conclusion is correct. The safeguards were in the main, I would say, window dressing. Why do I say that? If you have a country, you have its system of collecting revenues and spending money, its governance impaired. You start the crisis with that. Is there some quick fix? Are there some easy mechanisms when you are going to provide money directly to the budget, in effect, that you can somehow sort of fix holes in the budget? The real answer is no, you can't. You're really relying on the system that's already there. The safeguards that were introduced, an audit, 2 years later, is that going to really significantly matter at all in a situation where governance is weak? I don't think so. I think that the governance safeguards were in some sense designed to alleviate to some extent shareholder concerns, but in reality don't affect much on the ground. And that leads, I think, to the conclusion in the report that any work on governance and improving it has to be done before the crisis. It's the hard work of actually systematically improving state apparatus that matters. So I think that's what I would say there. And now I need to know how to stop sharing the screen, which I apologize for. Have I succeeded yet? Yes, I have. Great. The last point is on the corporate response. I was really disappointed at the manner in which the report concludes on HR issues. I think the chart, it's chart figure 29 in the report, on how in the midst of a mega crisis where all the activities of the operation really shift to lending, massive shift to lending, and we see zero change in resources allocated to frontline departments. This was a serious corporate failure, and and at the same time, business as usual proceeding with large-scale transfers and inflows and outflows of staff. This showed a complete disconnect from external reality. And so I think the report could have been a lot more forceful in saying, this system, the market-based system, business as usual, doesn't work in a crisis, and you need to develop something different. So you kind of hint at it in the language, but I think I would have welcomed a much stronger and more forceful conclusion. The recommendations, I think, are consistent with some of the lessons we've learned, which is that you need to prepare now, and you need to have some of the institutions and capacity in place prior to a pandemic, rather than seeking to respond on the hoof. Let me pause there. Again, I should stress broad agreement with the conclusions of the report and of the analysis, but I thought it useful to highlight some areas of difference, which actually echo, I think, Alejandro's points in many ways. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sean. I think both you and Alejandro pushed quite hard for sort of recommendations going even further than what we had. I'm going to turn to Prakash, and then also it'd be interesting to hear Rosemary's thoughts and reactions on the comments from Alejandro and Sean. Let me just mention that there is one question in the chat, which Prakash may also like to respond to. This is from Heinz Rudolph, saying that the credit agencies were also part of the problem, as they were as lost as the rest in terms of risk assessment. They took a conservative approach by downgrading assets, but losing the AAA rating in the middle of the pandemic would have been a source of risk that was difficult to predict. Any comments? So Prakash, let me turn first to you, to reactions to comments made by Rosemary, Alejandro, and Sean, and then I'll turn to Rosemary, and then we'll see if there are more comments or questions in the chat. Prakash.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thanks to Rosemary, Sean, and Alejandro. I think I would perhaps respond to just a couple of points. First, on the fiscal policy advice, I mean, I don't have a great disagreement with what was stated, but I do think that the fund successfully avoided a headline that says fund breaches austerity in the midst of a once in 100-year crisis. And I think what you've characterized as a bit slick and a little too easy was, I think, needed. And I'm putting my calm hat on, having served in the IMF's external relations and communications departments. I think that was an achievement of the fund not to end up getting tagged with the austerity label. I agree that once it was clear that the crisis was going to be a 2-year rather than a 3-month crisis, that calibrations should have been made, and they were made in the details of the advice, but perhaps the message remained a little too slick for too long. I actually don't really agree with the view that that the slogan was just something that was not useful. As I think Sean said, sending the message to countries that the fund is on the side of is supporting government spending more was an important message to give. To me, reminding countries that they face budget constraints at that moment would not have been terribly helpful. Telling them that they had to cut back on health or education, which is difficult at the best of times at that moment, would not have been helpful either. So I think the fund did the right thing on fiscal policy advice. A couple of points on Sean's discussion of strategy. I do agree that the fund did quite well at the outset, and having the risk unit in SPR, having Res prepared, done a lot of scenario analysis and so on, did pay off during the crisis. And in our recommendations, we do suggest doing much more of this in the future. We have a specific recommendation about doing tabletop exercises. And one suggestion, sort of responding to Sean, at least tangentially, is that we think that these tabletop exercises could be done jointly with the World Bank, so that you play out beforehand how in the next crisis the bank and the fund are going to collaborate, including at the strategic and senior levels. And the shareholders get a chance to see how in the next crisis, in a scenario playing out sense, how the bank and the fund could better collaborate. On Sean's point again about sort of lending and why we don't just support higher access in the future, and what do we mean by tailoring, I think we do have in mind, for instance, the SDS, the small developing states that you mentioned, which we think did not really receive tailored help in this crisis. And looking ahead, what we are advocating is not that you would simply, raise the access limits. You say, last time we did 100 and that was too small, so this time we do 200 for everyone. Our feeling would be rather that you, on the one hand, perhaps screen out more cases where governance is an issue, giving them smaller levels of access initially, and perhaps building up if some of the concerns can be addressed even in the midst of a crisis. Whereas countries like SDS, which, as you said, Sean, sometimes get completely wiped out, would get much more access. So we're not saying what happened during the pandemic was not the right thing to have done pragmatically, but when you're thinking about the future, is that going to be our recommendation? You just scale up for everyone in the next crisis? Our answer is no. We should at least discuss having a more tailored approach where, yes, you increase access depending on your initial sense of the scale of the crisis, but then it is tailored to the needs of the situation. On the corporate response, you said, Sean, that you were disappointed that the report was not even more forceful about the large-scale failure to reallocate staff resources. Perhaps in the main report, you're right at characterizing it that way, but in the recommendations, we do make a very pointed, specific recommendation that in the next crisis, thought should be given ahead of time to having a more centralized system during a crisis. But that agreement has had to have taken place beforehand. I don't think in the midst of a crisis, you're asking staff to do a lot, and you also are saying, well, by the way, we're also putting in place this new centralized system. I think that discussion should take place in peacetime so that staff know in the next crisis, there is going to be kind of a temporary suspension of the free market, and we're going to move around to where we are asked. If I can take just a minute or two more, I want to just go through. I mean, the question in the chat is for Alejandro. So Alejandro, I will perhaps leave that to you. as I said, we did take seriously the notion that the fund did not give enough. I think that's why we pointed out in the report that the scale of the lending was 30 billion, and that's not too much compared to other programs or compared to the needs of the situation. On the forecasts, I think we are in agreement. The move to a more top-down approach was needed, but it is the case that in the large countries, the fund was pessimistic. We point out that consensus forecasts, the private sector was also unduly pessimistic in June. So that's the sense in which we are not inclined to just blame the top-down approach as being the source of the forecast error, because it's difficult to explain why consensus would also make those same errors in the same direction. Let me perhaps stop here and give others a chance. I can come back to a few other things if there is time.
Okay, thanks very much, Prakash. Maybe turn now to Rosemary for reactions, perhaps to what the other panelists have said.
Thanks, Charles. I think maybe let me just briefly address or react to maybe 3 or 4 points on advice, lending, internal resources, and then kind of lastly to tie it all together on the board and our role. So on the headline advice, I kind of tend to think that the tagline, in a way, if you will, about, spend, but keep the receipt is probably something that is a bit more intuitive for the larger community to absorb. But it is true that when you then look at it and you think about, okay, what does that mean in terms of actual actionable policy actions and what policy makers need to be doing, that there is a bit of a gap. And I feel that a lot of that discussion actually then takes place at the bilateral surveillance level between authorities and the country teams, because they would then be able to, okay, this is kind of the broad general policy direction that we are going in, but then these are the things which you would need to kind of think about, especially towards the later part of the pandemic, when we were starting to think about unwinding the measures and the large stimulus that was put forward. So these are areas which I think we will kind of continue to kind of poke at and to do the engagement between the authorities and the country teams. On lending, here, I think there are, and I think the nature of such evaluations is really useful because it brings different perspectives and the need for, considering various angles and balancing out all the different angles and concerns together. So I think it is maybe true that there was a huge need and there was kind of need to maybe consider raising the excess limits. Sean said that, well, going to the board would not have been able to approve a huge increase. But I think it was also a matter of maybe just underlying the fact that the situation was also very uncertain. Everyone agreed that more needs to be done. We need to be more proactive in helping members. But then there are also considerations about the fund implications on the fund's own resources, as was highlighted in the report. The impact on debt sustainability and debt capacity of members, as well as just kind of whether there are other concerns and how to apply this all in an even-handed way that will ensure that there's enough to go around. So I think we kind of, well, we're not perfect, we're learning, and there are reviews coming up which, in a longer term basis, some of these observations would be useful as you consider the policy direction. But I also wanted to point out that in the case of the pandemic, it is a global public health crisis that we have never seen before. So I think apart from kind of also coming up with the financing support, there was also a lot of other areas that needed to work in tandem to help authorities. So again, towards the later part of the pandemic, helping to secure vaccines, to deploy them, and to also work with other agencies and organizations to ensure that these can be kind of deployed and actually reach the people who need the vaccines the most. So it really is a whole package and various considerations that need to be managed. On internal resources, I think certainly something that we are at the board very sensitized to, especially as I said in my remarks earlier, we continue to operate under a condition or environment of very, very high workload. The crisis never seems to abate. And the same skill sets, I would say, keeps being called upon. So the point is also well taken that, at some point, maybe we would need to take a more concerted look at, in a time of a crisis, how do we more proactively redeploy resources to make sure that there is sufficient to go around, but also that the skill sets match the job. And if not, then how can we provide some quick support to ensure that, people who are redeployed are able to step up very quickly to the roles. Which leads me to just comment very quickly on how the board comes in. I think in the report, it was also mentioned that engagement with the board could have come at an earlier stage. The board could have also been consulted earlier. I see this as something which, again, we are in the process of learning about as we deal with the different crises and uncertainty. But it was also a balance, again, at a time where when staff and management are also busy trying to fight the crisis. How do you provide that strategic direction? How do you, ask enough questions to steer the direction without also interfering with a lot of the operational aspects of the fund? So these, I guess, are issues that will continue to be the subject of debate. Certainly also happy to hear any reactions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rosemary, for those insights and nuances. Maybe I'll just say a few words, and then there are a couple more comments and questions in the chat. The board discussion was really interesting. I think we, if you look at the summing up, you'll get a flavor of that discussion. At the board, there was generally strong support for the points we made about the fund needing to be better prepared for future crises, to do work in advance. So recommendation 2, really got very, very broad support. Recommendation 1 was more tricky. Recommendation 1 was saying that the fund needed to develop a toolkit that would be useful in future crises. So this is like going beyond business as usual in terms of the lending instruments, in terms of the budget, and in terms of the reallocation of staff. We did actually get very strong support for that last point on the reallocation of staff. So that message was actually delivered, and I think all board members supported that quite strongly, and hopefully that will feature in the implementation plan. Where the board had really quite mixed views was on whether it was worth developing new instruments in advance that would be appropriate for a crisis situation, that would go beyond the tweaks that the fund made to its toolkit during the pandemic, in particular to increase the emergency financing access and to introduce a new precautionary facility. Our advice is that the fund needs to do a lot more thinking about this, and I think that would then help to address concerns that both Alejandro and Sean raised, that the fund actually didn't do enough to help countries in really an extraordinarily difficult situation. And when just to add a bit of a nuance to that, I would say the fund actually did extend lending to low-income countries, concessional financing, really to the limit of resources that it had. And the problem there was that the fund was unable to raise concessional resources to finance much more lending from the PRGT. But in the GRA side, the general resources of the fund, the non-concessional lending, the appetite was quite limited, as Prakash said in his initial presentation. And countries didn't feel that they could really do much more in terms of conditionality in the context of everything else that was going on. Alejandro was actually quite successful in Western Hemisphere in getting countries to sign up to precautionary facilities, which was quite useful. And the precautionary facilities have the feature that they don't require ex post conditionality. But other regions really did not show much appetite. Like, for example, Asia, there's very little in that direction. So I really do feel that there could be more thinking about how to make the various fund facilities, precautionary facilities, the emergency facilities, more amenable to the needs of a crisis. That is, to increase countries' access while also recognizing that in such situations the fund has greater tolerance for risk. But this does need to be thought through very carefully, and you can't do it very well in the middle of a crisis. You really have to do it in advance of the crisis. At least that was our argument, and I think we got some board support, but we certainly did not get broad support in all aspects of that. And I think there's more work to be done by fund staff, by management, and possibly the IEO will want to come back and do a second evaluation in due course once we have more information, have benefit of more time. I should stop speaking there. Let me just read out a couple more comments and questions in the chat, and then go back to each of you for any final remarks or responses. There was a comment by Guohua Huang that the charts on reallocation are actually a little bit misleading, because the charts focus on interdepartmental reallocation, whereas in fact there was some reallocation within departments. For example, in the Fiscal Affairs Department, economists were shifted from capacity development work to program work. Then Kari Karonen of the European Stabilization Mechanism has 2 points. One was a little bit more comparing the fund strengths to other IFIs in the earlier response, and then secondly, for a little bit more on how monetary policy advice could have been more agile in the early stages. And then there's a question from Jarek Vitskorish on the effectiveness of government safeguards, which were mostly related to the procurement of goods and services. In the end, given that such spending represented a fraction of resources, could you comment on the relevance of these safeguards? Is it possible they amount not only to window dressing, as Sean put it, but they're also not very relevant, if not outright counterproductive, and eventually prove to be unenforceable? That last point is something we were not able to assess, given the time horizon of the evaluation. So let's now turn back to our panelists, and then to Prakash for final words, and then we'll wrap up what I think has been a really interesting conversation. So maybe go back to you, Alejandro, for any thoughts, and if you want to comment on that question about the credit rating agencies as well, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Charles. Look, I don't think that for MDBs, I was not advocating to consciously move to a AA rating, but if aggressive borrowing and lending would have led to a AA+ rating for those agencies, nothing would have happened. I think the increase in funding costs would have been relatively small. I mean, and you look at what happened with countries that actually undertook that type of borrowing, and I think it would have made sense. I think our criticism that the response in terms of lending was much smaller than what was needed involves the advanced economies, the fund, and the emerging and developing economies. As I said, I mean, there were many developing economies and emerging markets that were offered within the context of an EFF significantly backloaded adjustments and front-loaded expansions to help support the populations and the economy, etc. And they did not take it because of political, I think, implications domestically. And I think also the SDR allocation discussion also made a lot of countries say, I'm going to wait until the SDR allocation comes. So that maybe hindered a little bit the use of UCT upper tranche programs. I think the SSL, we all knew that SLL, we all knew that it was not going to work, but we had it there and we just threw it out just to see if somebody wanted it. But I think it's completely dominated by the FCL. And I think it will be arrogant from us, the IMF community, to think that instruments that we develop for completely different purposes are the best instruments to work in a global pandemic or a global shock of this nature. So I totally support you, Charles, in that we need to think a little bit more on new instruments. And also I think we need to have an automatic rescheduling of our repayments to the fund under natural disasters. Just rescheduling with new programs, maybe countries don't want to make a new program, but I think we should not be taking money from especially small states after natural disasters has hit them. Those are my comments.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Sean? You're muted.
Thoughts, Charles. Firstly, on Prakash's comment about the messaging, and it would not have been useful to remind governments of budget constraints. That wasn't my suggestion at all. You don't have to remind governments about financing constraints. This is what they faced head on. And in a sense, the advice we were offering assumed away financing constraints. And I think this is something actually that emerges in the work in the comments of the African department, for example. So the message worked well for advanced economies, but for countries that face genuine financing constraints in the sense of particularly if you've got thin domestic bond markets and so forth, we were kind of assuming away something that was really important. On the issue of the emergency limits, there's a comment in the chat from Petia Cueva Brooks, who played a central role in the fund's response in the first half of 2020, saying raising access limits automatically any crisis would be misguided, which I think is absolutely correct. My comment on saying the increase should have been higher than 100%. I was just struck that you actually conclude 100 was the right number, and I was a little surprised at that, because I think you could have made the case differently, and certainly looking ahead, that number will need to be a key issue for analysis, perhaps with the frills of adding in situations. You can't do it for small states, that would be illegal, but in unequal treatment. But you could do it for countries where the external shock is massive and basically destroys the export sector, which is probably much the same thing. And so I think again, my comments on governance were not that it wasn't important. It's just that you cannot really significantly improve governance in a country in a short period of time. And there are no quick fixes. It would have been nice if there were. It would have been nice if one could tell the advanced economy taxpayers that, yes, we have these safeguards in place, but it just wasn't on the cards. Let me pause there. Thank you. Charles.
Yeah, Charles. Yeah.
Okay, Rosemary, any final thoughts from you at this point before we?
No, I think just very briefly to also we think about it in the longer term context, and these are certainly kind of learning points that should be taken into account as we better prepare the fund for crisis preparedness and enhance our toolkits, and also to really then look at how each of these tweaks would interact in the broader kind of picture. Especially also in the report, we kind of look at enterprise risk, but we now also have an enterprise risk management framework that is more comprehensive. So really how then these all fit in, and whether we would be able to have more information to go further or to do more and to calibrate our policies. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rosemary. Prakash, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, very quickly on Kari's questions. There is a background paper, the fourth background paper 4, that talks about our collaboration with partners. And in that context, Kari talks about how the IMF's response sort of measures against that of others. I think most agencies found the the response, most evaluation offices found the responses of their agencies to be pretty quick. But I think when we spoke to authorities, the fund's response was characterized as particularly agile and very useful in the early months of the crisis. But there is a lot more detail in that background paper. And on monetary policy, this is a point we've made in a previous evaluation as well. We feel that the fund ought to be sort of more on top of being able to provide good advice to emerging markets and low-income countries on monetary policy developments. And we feel countries were undertaking unconventional monetary policies in EMs without the benefit of fund advice or discussion, and the fund could be kind of the place where these discussions happen, and it did not happen this time around. And finally, on Yarek's point, as Charles said, we cannot assess implementation, but we did hear from authorities what you mentioned, namely that they were questioning the relevance of some of the governance safeguards in their particular context. So I think that already is an issue, and that again is something to discuss in peacetime. You know, what kinds of safeguards are useful, which ones are clearly not going to be very applicable in some countries' circumstances. Well, let me stop there, Charles.
Thanks very much, Prakash. So let me wrap this discussion up. I think it's really been a very lively, interesting discussion. I think this debate has just begun. I think there are a lot of issues that were put on the table that really will merit further consideration, and hope this evaluation has helped that discussion that should continue over time. I mean, we're still getting more comments coming in the chat, and I would also just reinforce this idea that certainly what we're suggesting is nothing that would be automatic in terms of increasing access limits or anything else, but rather thinking in advance, thinking in peacetime, as Prakash says, about what would be an appropriate set of instruments in the middle of a crisis. Is the fund's regular toolkit for business as usual what is most appropriate for a crisis? I think we're raising a number of suggestions to suggest that perhaps some modifications would be needed, but those modifications would, of course, need to be calibrated carefully in the context of an actual crisis with full consultation with the board. And I think that would then help to address some of the concerns that Sean and Alejandro have made. Anyway, as I say, we're in what I think and hope is the beginning of a very interesting debate, and I hope that we have contributed to that debate. And if you're interested in seeing the reports, they are available on our website. So let me close it with a big round of thanks to our panelists for a really interesting set of comments, and to Prakash for an excellent presentation right at the start, and for all of you who've joined this discussion this morning. Thanks very much indeed, and hopefully we'll continue this discussion going forward. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.